In the last video, I've talked about the left a few times, mainly to criticize leftists in both my country and online. I feel obligated to say that I am myself a leftist. I'm on the far left and I am kind of a pessimist. I can come up with endless things to talk about when it comes to going against the far right, and yet I don't think it's useful most of the time. I can go against the French far right for our elections with mainly the fact that they are sold out to Russia, and yet I don't think I'm going to convince anybody. I prefer talking about the left since a lot of them are much easier to convince, which is partially why I'm a pessimist. Changing people's mind is close to impossible. Once they're set and rooted, it has to come from them. And all this doesn't take into account all of the other problems, like the hollow activism and the fact that having genuine ideas doesn't help this world of lies and deceit. You can have genuine ideas and no one will be able to make the difference between you and someone that is lying. Companies taking pride colors to get more money, and this being some of the only genuine conversation starter, and that's simply because companies are just more popular than anyone else. But the overall problem is that change doesn't come from us, it doesn't depend on us. It doesn't wait on us to act. Change depends on leaders, and it depends on what we really would love to call a democracy. Last elections, I voted for a leftist, knowing fully that they had no chance of winning. But I liked their program. Now, 5 years later, I realize how stupid I was. Voting for a program really isn't it. Last video I did on the far left, I didn't talk much about the program rather than the LARPy undertone that they have within our elections, and how it's not going to help in anything. Today, elections are more about personality and celebrity worship. They're about what the guy we put in place is, and not really the ideas that they have or those they pretend to have. For instance, a lot of the French left would want me to vote for the current most popular left-wing party in France, which is Mélenchon. But I don't trust the guy. His program is really interesting and positive, but he has bad takes on Ukraine and Crimea and Europe, and I'm not going to vote for some guy who changes his mind depending on what's popular. Or for a guy that has good takes on LGBT issues, but because he's up with Russia. It is why I find it hard to go forward in politics. Because either I have to compromise and go for someone I despise because they're the least worst of the populars, and I know they're going to make some amount of good choices, or I vote for a complete loose cannon that plays fast and loose with human rights, but at least is on the same line as I am. Or pretends to be, once again. And this kind of choice seems to become more and more present. A bit more than a year ago, there was the election in the US, where the compromise was just as bad. And Ukraine is where there's a lot of hope for the left as well. A lot of people seem to be taking issue like they look at the rest of the problems in the world. Often enough, a position is the best take. But it's not 100% accurate. So many times, I've seen anarchists be correct in pointing out that two things can be bad at once when talking with tankies, adding a level of nuance that was needed. But there, I see a lot of people take the same line simply because they want to oppose NATO out of principle. Or they talk about the war crimes of other countries rather than pay attention to what's currently going on. Which is kind of out of topic. This is obviously frustrating, but it's far from the worst. The worst is that despite all the plays that we agree and disagree on, all the activism, all the real desire for change within the current systems and more, despite all of this, we will probably never reach the end goals of any movement. Because once again, the power really isn't in our hands. A lot of the progress that we could do is impossible to reach. We can try and protest against war in Ukraine, but for what? Many countries are fucked because whether you have a nuke or not doesn't make you more competent or useful against a war. So apart from morale boosting, I don't really see the use of it. You can work in a soup kitchen and help people this way, but you will never run out of work. You will always have to help. The use you have is always temporary. The point is, systems will probably not change. We're currently in a shit timeline where we are heading straight to disaster. And that's my pessimism. The fact that whatever we do, the ideals remain and will always remain unreachable. But despite this, there's a slight silver lining. In 50 years from now, when climate change will still be getting exponentially worse, when capital will ruin even more life than it's doing today, there's one thing that we could do to make it better. And I guess that's solidarity? Keeping the work at the soup kitchen will never solve homelessness or hunger, but it will help a lot of people. Protests may not lead to any radical change that is needed, but it might lead to some people changing their minds and being nicer to each other. We might be heading to a dystopia, but at least we can have a little bit of power on the way we treat each other, if nothing else. And that's why I've not lost all hope. That's why, despite my pessimism, I think keeping the fight is very important. If people can make themselves useful for or against the cause, there might be some small changes towards a better world. A pro-trans rights dystopia is better one where LGBT people are just getting murdered. And maybe, just maybe, there's enough chance where we can actually avoid the worst? Maybe? Alright, rant done. Be kind to each other.